Guest from Sarada Convent, Santa Barbara, California. She is Pravrajika Krishnaprana Mataji. She is in charge of the center there. Her very personality and an experience in living Vedanta for 50 years and more. Today's scripture class, regular will not be there. In its place will be Mataji's reminiscences of the monks that she met in the West, and also maybe a few in the East, whatever she wants to say. You can understand 50 years she has many monks that, and got blessing and got training in Vedanta, rich source of all wonderful memories of great monks of our order, and maybe nuns of Sarada Convent and San Francisco Convent and Hollywood Convent. So now I request Mataji to please.
Okay, thank you. Well, I've been asked to talk about just reminiscences of the monks that I have met. And the first one I met was Swami Prabhavananda, who was my guru. And that was kind of by accident. I was just going on a vacation to sunny California. That's what I thought. Now, this was in 1968, and I had just finished teaching in Hawaii. I grew up on Puget Sound in Seattle. So if any of you have been in Seattle, you will know that it rains 10 months out of the year. And it's gray, and it's drizzly and gloomy. But I got a job in Hawaii, and I went, whoa, there are places where the sun shines all the time. So some friends asked me, came back from Hawaii, 2 years teaching over there. And I went back up to Bellingham, and a group of hippies were going down the coast in a Volkswagen bus for a vacation in Santa Barbara. So I went, yeah, I want to go too. So we went. And when we arrived in Santa Barbara, the person that had the bus said, well, I know someone who lives up in the mountains. So we were going up there, and we were going to stay at their place. It was kind of her husband was an artist, and they had built large one-room buildings, which were partially his studio and partially livable. But we arrived that day, and she said, oh, do you want to meet my teacher? We'd just walk up the hill and we'll go see him. And everyone else was really enthusiastic because they had been looking for some kind of religious meaning, some kind of purpose in life. I personally wasn't. I was happy to be in the sunshine. So we went up to the convent. It was the convent. And we walked into the living room. And here was this rather small man. He was 5'4" in his youth. God knows what he was when I met him. Well, not quite 5'4", just sitting in the living room in his pants and shirt and sweater, reading the newspaper. And we did not, he greeted us and he said, oh, I'm so glad you've come. It's wonderful. What are you doing? Where are you from? No talk of God, no talk of religion, nothing. He just chatted with us. And after that, I came with the feeling that I really wanted to come back down because he was the most peaceful, happy man that I had ever seen. Everything was just fine, just the way it was. And he was happy to receive us. We didn't bother him walking in out of the blue. And we did not necessarily look like the best people. I mean, we were kids. We were like 20, 23, 24. We were dressing like kids did in that era. We had long hair, either jeans or short skirts on, either one, whichever. And he just accepted, oh, you're here. So we made arrangements to move down the next year, moved to Santa Barbara, attended the temple, and this is going to sound really bad. We attended the temple when he spoke. Swami Vandanananda was there at the time. I never heard one of his lectures because I only wanted to hear Swami Prabhavananda. And the rest of the time, tourist, teaching school again. We went up to volunteer every weekend that Swami was there at the convent. So, okay, sooner or later I decided, I read the gospel and it said, you should live with your guru and check out everything. So I went to him and I said, I think I should be in the convent for a while. And I did say a while. It was not a lifetime commitment. It was going to be close to my guru. And he said, oh yes, I think you should. And he laughed about it. But when I moved in, I had the great good fortune of becoming one of his cooks and being able to give personal service to him almost from I think it was the second month I'd moved in, which was not the usual thing, but it was interesting because my experiences with him were sometimes mystifying, sometimes unpleasant or uncomfortable. I won't say they were ever unpleasant, they were uncomfortable. He was a very dramatic Swami. He was a very dramatic Bengali, and he would present things so they made an impression. If he was telling you that you were doing something wrong, it was usually loudly in front of you. And so it did make an impression. You would get these scoldings and they go on and on and on and on. And when you were one of his cooks, you got a lot of the scoldings because, anyway. But the one thing I noticed, he would scold. I went down to Hollywood to cook for him every month to give the woman down there a break. And I noticed that I'd go into his room and he'd start scolding and I'd wonder, what is he talking about? Because I really had no idea. And it went on. And then people would walk out of his room and the scolding stopped. Did. And he just would sit there. People would walk into his room and he'd take up where he left off. And I was going like, what is this man doing? I mean, I loved him, but I was really like, what in the name of Christopher is he trying to accomplish? And then, a couple times I had literally no idea. I knew I hadn't done anything. And it went on and on and on. And finally, one of my sister nuns from Santa Barbara, as we walked out and I was going, I don't know what that was about. She said, oh, that was all for me. She said, I couldn't take that kind of a scolding. So he scolded you, but I got the message because that was all for me. So he did that kind of thing that we read about that Maharaj did. He was totally and absolutely devoted to Maharaj. I'm sure some of you have read The Eternal Companion. And at the convent in Santa Barbara, some of you have been there. It's a large property and a lot of oak trees and a lot of paths that you go along. Well, he would get out when I first moved in, and he still wasn't quite as infirm. He would get out on Sunday mornings and sweep some of the paths. He said, these oak leaves will hurt Maharaj's feet. And he always told us, Maharaj walks here. Don't pick all the flowers off the front path because he likes them. And he honestly felt and saw Maharaj. We all hoped to. We didn't have quite the same experience, but he imbued us with that kind of reverence and constant thought of, you're doing everything, even sweeping the path, you're doing it for the Lord, you're doing it for your guru, you're doing it for the love of God. So we have two shrines on the, we have two shrines on the property. We have the temple and we have what we call the small shrine, what most of the Swamis call Mother Shrine. In the big temple, we have one picture of Ramakrishna, big painting, and a small picture that we worship. And he didn't want any more than that. He said, no, don't keep it simple in the temple where the public are coming. Now in the small shrine, we have everyone. And we have Ramakrishna, Holy Mother's feet. I'm doing this in order of the Sunday school. Shiva, Ganesha, Krishna, Maharaj, Holy Mother, Swami Vivekananda, Jesus and Mary and Buddha. We take the Sunday school down there and they learned how to do this. So when I first moved in, there were 8 of us in the convent. The shrine is a 6 by 9 inside, 6 feet by 9 feet. I don't know what that is in centimeters. Small. But we would all go down, sitting on the floor and meditate with him. And that's what he insisted on when we were there. We did everything with him. So when he couldn't go to the shrine anymore, he said, you come to my room and meditate. So we did that. But he was teaching us all the time. It wasn't formal classes in the scriptures. He was teaching us rather like what I believe he had encountered in Bellarmont, because he was very young when he moved in, and he knew Maharaj well. He knew Koka Maharaj well, and Swami Premananda. And he said, he used to laugh with Koka Maharaj. And he said, but I got so upset because one of the first nights I came, he said, you come stay in my room. No, sleep on my bed with me. And he said, I was so afraid to move all night. But it was that kind of closeness that he also imbued his monasteries and convents with. He said, don't get larger than 12 people. You lose the family feeling. You become an institution. So that was how our early training was. Then I also had the fortune to meet, he passed away before I took brahmacharya, because he passed away 4 years after I moved into the convent. So Swami Swahananda came down to take charge, and he was so different. He wasn't standoffish, he was shy. He honestly didn't know how to make the first move. I had been going to visit him because my parents lived in Seattle. So every time we'd go up from Santa Barbara to Seattle, we'd stop in Berkeley and Swami Swahananda. Now, one of our first visits to him, it was the day before People's Park in Berkeley when the National Guard for the first time came out again in mass to take a stand against citizens of the United States because there was anti-Vietnam War protests going on. And I was visiting Swami Swahananda, and we saw the National Guard gather. They all had those big shields, and it was awful. And I said, Swami, you better come with us. This is not safe. And he said, oh no, I have to be at the center. I have to take care of the center. So he said, but you must get out of here now. So we did leave. And 40 years later, when he was the head of the society, we were chatting one night. I said, do you remember that day? And he said, oh, yes. I said, what happened? He said, I saved the garbage can. Evidently, the trash can had been out on the street, and he boldly went out and brought it into the center. And I said, okay, save the trash can. The rest of it made no impression on him. He was saving the center, and he had a way of he was not as dramatic as Swami Prabhupada, but in many ways he got his points across much more pointedly. He wanted us to start lecturing in Santa Barbara. He said the women should lecture. He was a great proponent of strong women and making them get out and take care of themselves and do. His mother had been very strong. So he said, you must start giving classes and you must lecture. And we went, don't think so. Don't think people are ready for it. Yes, you must. So we dutifully did a few classes. And the devotees who had been asking for it attended once and half-heartedly twice, and then no one came. And we said, Swami, they don't want to hear Western men or women. They still want to hear Indian Swamis. And he was quite disappointed. But we stopped giving these classes. We would take care of college classes that came and school classes that came and do that, but formal classes in the temple. So he kept trying. And finally we said, much, much later, we were sitting in his room up in the monastery, and I said, Swami, we'll do one Sunday every month in Santa Barbara. And we expected, what did we get? He went, And I looked at him, I said, And he went, I said, too little, too late? And he went, But he was so supportive of us. And so we did that, but we were a little slow on the uptake. Now, so when it came time, when he took over in 76, when Swami Prabhupada died, he became extremely concerned that vows on time and in the right sequence. He had been up in San Francisco, and the women up there had not had vows, and they waited years. So he gathered the Swamis in Southern California and gave probably 4 people and maybe 6 brahmacharya, and that must have been 1980, probably 1980. And so I had the good fortune of having Swami Asheshananda as my brahmacharya guru. He came down, Swami Shraddhananda was there, Swami Bhaskarananda come? I don't think so. Swami Shraddhananda, Swami Asheshananda, Swami Chaitanyananda, they all came, and all of our American monks from Trabuco, everyone gathers and we have a big ceremony. The same sannyas vows that they give in Bellarmont. So we did that, and then Swami insisted, that was another one. In 1984, which was the right time for me to get my sannyas, but I'd only had brahmacharya in 80, so there wasn't quite enough time between. But I didn't know that. And he was sitting in the living room, Swami Swahananda, and he said, no one has asked for sannyas. He was giving brahmacharya again. And I went to our head nun and I said, is it too soon for me to ask? And she said, well, when did you move in? And I said, 72. And she said, no, it's fine. So I went and asked him and he said, when did you move in? And I said, 72. And he said, yes, it's fine. Well, he gave me some. Swami Sheshananda came down again and I got sannyas all by myself because some of the other women had become official a year later or 2 years later. When he would get irritated with me, he would say, and you tricked me. You tricked me. And I went, what? When did I trick you? You asked for sannyas before it was time. You told me I could have it. But he'd say, oh, it wasn't enough time between, so he would do this. We had this going back and forth. But Swami Sheshananda now, one of our nuns moved in. Swami Prabhavananda died July 4th, 1976. So she had moved in April 1st, April Fool's Day, 1976. And he had not been well enough to initiate her, to give her diksha. So he asked her, who are you most drawn to? And she said, Swami Sheshananda. So she went up to Portland and got diksha and came back down. So we always made sure she had a trip to Portland every year to see him for a couple of weeks. And one of the others would go with him, or a couple would go with her to see him. I was still visiting my parents because I was an only child. And it was important, Swami said, to keep good relations with your parents. So I would go up to Seattle, and most of the time I would say, but now I have to go down to Portland and see Swami Sheshananda. And the first time I said that, my parents, who were not Buddhists and had been a little upset that I had joined a cult, when they met the nuns and they met Swami, they no longer thought I joined a cult, but it was the time when, they were worried about Eastern gurus. So we went down to Portland. They said, we'd like to come with you. And I said, okay. They'd already met Swami Prabhavananda, who was very outgoing and social and extremely, he was Western in a funny way, but still very Indian in another way. But he made Westerners feel very comfortable. Swami Sheshananda did the same, but in a much more interesting way. He came out, we went into what he called the foyer, which would be the lobby. And he came out and he goes, oh, you're so blessed to have a daughter who has become a nun. You would have no idea how lucky you are. Oh, it's wonderful. I'm so glad to meet you. And have any of you seen Swami Sheshananda? Okay, well, he was about my height, and he wore clothes that he had gotten from someone else. And he always looked like kind of humped over and messy. And his chutter was kind of, and it was interesting. And his hair was a little long. So in these clothes you couldn't get rid of, it was Swami Nikhilananda gave me that cap. Swami so-and-so gave me that jacket. And everything was dear to him because of his memories of his brothers. But he didn't look neat and tidy. So my father had been in the Navy and he was very neat and tidy. Here was this little bit, and he just looked at him and he just smiled, and Swami kept saying, "Would you like some prasad?" They had no idea what prasad was, none. And Swami Asheshananda would go out into the kitchen, prepare it all himself, chop, 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 and come out with little plates that he had assigned to everyone. But this time, I mean, I knew he was going to go through the door, go into the monastery and chop, 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 chop. He went in and he started screaming and yelling at one of the monks he had. "Americans are useless. You are awful. You have caused the problems of the world. Get out, get out." Chop, 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 came in with the plates, and he said to my mother, "Now this is your plate." He said to my father, "This one you will have. Now I'll go get," and he gave them to us, and he said, "Now I will go get you some water." Walked through the door again, and it was yelling again at this poor monk. And it went on and on and on. Then he came in and it was, "Oh, and here's a glass of water for you, and here's one for you, and here's..." My father was laughing so hard, he could hardly stand up. And he said, "Is he always like that?" And I went, "Yeah, pretty much so." Pretty much so. Yes. The other thing, in Santa Barbara, it's very, very, I think we have been told we're the most ritualistic center in the United States, possibly in the West, and even more so than most of the ones in India. Swami Asheshananda did the worship himself up there because he had been, Holy Mother's attendant for many, and Swami Saradananda's attendant. So he did the worship. Now, when we came up, the shrine vibrated when he did his worship. Okay, it really did. However, we would come in to help him. He didn't need help. But we would see dead flowers on the shrine and the pictures needed cleaning. And I think each one of us made the mistake of doing it once. We were not to touch it. He didn't want it. He had his own way of doing things. When he came in to do worship, if we were going sightseeing, he did the speed worship. It was ring, 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 ring. And he pointed and said the mantra so fast you didn't know what he was doing, and the worship was done. And then he would go into the kitchen and make the prasad. Every time he brought out pious, and we'd say, "Oh, the pious is so good, Swami." Milk was going bad. I mean, it's just like, okay. And he had 2 houses for women to stay in up there. One was Holy Mother's house and one was Sri Sarada house. And those women that were up there, I swear they were all saints. They held full-time jobs, and they had to take care of all the visitors that came, all the female visitors that came. They had to take them sightseeing, they had to take them here and there and do everything. And it was with full-time jobs. I said, "How do you do it?" And they said, "Oh, it's all right." Now, he had one woman, Mrs. Vera Edwards. Everyone was Mr. Todd Thomas, Mrs. Vera Edwards. He was formal in that way. Mrs. Vera Edwards was his driver, and she drove them everywhere. I did not have this experience. It was Devi Prana, who was his disciple, Bhava Prana, and Vraja Prana, who were all visiting. They were driving on the freeway, and the freeways in Portland are mostly elevated. I find them really awful, but that's okay. And they were driving along in the fast lane, and all of a sudden, Swami Asheshananda, who reads every side and kind of mumbled, 50 miles an hour, Costco. And this goes on all the time. all of a sudden he said to Mrs. Vera Edwards, "You missed the exit, back up." Now she's in the fast lane on the freeway. And the three nuns in the back seat, one goes like this to brace for the crash. One goes totally, and his disciple is pounding on the seat that he's sitting in. "You can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that." Mrs. Vera Edwards backed up, got on the right exit, and they proceeded on their trip. Okay, so Mrs. Vera Edwards came down to Santa Barbara 20 years later, and we were talking about it, and Davy Prana said, "Do you remember that?" And she said, "We were never in any kind of trouble. No, it was fine." Now, that was, to me, a disciple that really followed her guru's instructions with faith. She said, "No, there was no problem. We just went back to the ex." I don't remember. But he was eccentric. He also did all of his own lawn mowing. He mowed the lawns at Holy Mother's house, at Sarada House. And he mowed it, he pushed this lawnmower around, and he had on these old clothes, this hat from World War II that had ear flaps, and it was really dirty. His jacket wasn't too clean either. And he'd mow the lawn, and it was kind of a haphazard affair. Some was cut and some wasn't, but the next door neighbors to Sri's Holy Mother's house said, "Could you tell your gardener to stop mowing our lawn?" And they said, "Your gardener?" But, and who else? Another Swami in the West, Swami Vivedishananda, who was not like Swami Sheshananda at all. He was very quiet and very sweet. All of them, Swami Sheshananda was Holy Mother's disciple, but all of the original founders of the American centers are Maharaja's disciples, Raja Maharaja's disciples. So they were very close to each other, and they would all come. Most of the centers closed in the summer for at least a month. Hollywood didn't. And one of our devotees who lived part-time in Chicago and part-time in Laguna Beach would move out of her house in Laguna Beach and let the Swami stay there right on the beach, and they could relax and just joke and just be themselves. Occasionally devotees would come, but not really. It was their time to be brothers. And so Swami Pavitrananda came every summer. Swami Vivedishananda came as long as he could travel. Swami Satprakashananda came. Swami Sarvagatananda came. Who else came out on a regular basis? I think that was about it, the ones that I met. Before Swami Ganeshwarananda, who was in Chicago, came. Vishwananda came for the original vows of the nuns. They all came for that. Swami Nikhilananda didn't come. In fact, I didn't meet him. Swami went to him to go to Thousand Island Park and spend some time in the summer. With some of the nuns, he traveled with them and they went over there. But Swami Vivedishananda, he was quite close to, and he would come down. And then, he had that stroke and was bedridden in a coma basically for years, and Swami Bhaskarananda took care of him. But you would go and sit in his room when in this coma, and you could feel that there was a very holy presence there. It was not, when you meditated in there, it was transforming, actually. I mean, the concentration. When I had seen him in probably, must have been 73 or 4, he had come down to Santa Barbara and he was a little bit blind, tiny bit. And he was going out one of our doors. All doors that lead outside have steps. There's not one level place on our property. And I was kind of hesitant to grab him as I would have grabbed my grandfather to make sure he didn't fall. But I thought, I would grab him. And I was ready to. And he turned around, he says, "Aren't you going to take a hold of me so I don't fall?" And I went, "Yes, I am." And then he started reciting the verses of Shankara about how in your old age you lose your sight, you walk with a stick, da, 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 da. And he said, you must memorize things because you'll never know when your mind will be your only companion. And I thought, that's what he had done his entire life. You must memorize so you have the companionship of your own mind. And I thought, they say in a coma no one's there, but I think there was. I don't think he could communicate. He couldn't say, but he did have that. There was that feeling, that palpable feeling of he did have the companionship of his own mind, and that was rolling around all the time. Then, which other Swamis? Swami Chaitanyananda, of course, I know, because he came to the United States when I joined the convent, and he's only a few years older. So we were all young in the Southern California at the same time. It was such a change for him, because all of a sudden he was in this monastery where there were women running around all the time. We were taking care of Swami Prabhavananda, and he was just like, I'm a monk. And then he's always had a touchy stomach. And I was cooking in the kitchen and he would come in, and I remember one day he told me, I'll show you how to make dal. And I went, okay. That wasn't my expertise. And he told me, you put the dal in, you put a lot of water, and you put a whole cauliflower, and you cook it until the cauliflower disappears. And I kind of went, I don't think that's going to happen. Okay. So, he was cute. He had a little trouble he had quite a thick accent when he first arrived. And so Swami Prabhavananda usually sent all the assistants as they came to California to a woman who taught elocution to actors and actresses to help them with their accents. Well, it sort of took, but he was talking about he was relating the Greeks to something in the Mahabharata, and he was saying, yes, and it's like Penelope and her suitors. And our Western audience went, Penelope and her suitors. And finally we got it was Penelope suitors. But that one took a while for us to understand. And then he tried to give a lecture on Tantra, which he was going to give us a lecture on Tantra, and he'd say, but I am a monk. We never heard anything but that he was a monk. We never got any Tantra. So, but that was when he was very young. So, we still, when it's hard to, when we were in San Francisco, just before I came here for the vows, we gave two of the women in San Francisco took some yas vows. on Guru Purnima, and so everyone had gathered there. And Swami Chaitanananda is now the senior monk in the United States. And for us, it's like, really? And he goes, we're all getting old. but he says, we're still, these are my sisters. Yeah. It's funny how I had more advantage that I didn't take advantage of it with Swami Vandanananda. I met him in India on my first trip. I didn't even meet him in the United States. Swami Ritajananda used to come over and stay in Santa Barbara. He liked pancakes, and he had a special brand of pancakes he liked. He liked Aunt Jemima. Aunt Jemima's, which is not politically correct anymore. They had to change the name. So, but he said, yes, you make Aunt Jemima pancakes for me. Okay. He also liked running shoes. Now, are you familiar with the brand Adidas? Well, he called them Adidas. He said, get my Adidas. And I thought, okay. Yeah. It was funny. Swami Sachidananda, who had the yoga group, he and Ritajananda had been brahmacharis together in Bangalore, I think. And Swami Sachidananda, had a place in Santa Barbara. So when Swami Ritajananda came, he came down to visit him, and they were just laughing and carrying on about when they were young brahmacharis. Swami Sachidananda had to leave because he wasn't healthy enough. They were afraid he was not going to be able to live long enough to be a monk. And here he lived to 98 or something, and taught yoga all over the world internationally. But he was fun. He stopped by often when he was in Santa Barbara. He had a great big Cadillac that was peacock blue. And at that time, everyone had the radios where they talked to each other, CB radios, I think. Anyway, and his call identification was peacock. And one of our devotees, who Swami named Tatwamasi, they would converse while they were driving down the freeway. No cell phones in those days, they were radios. So, yeah. He also Swami Ritajananda also knew one Indian medicine men that came, and he came to see him. Lame Deer. I don't know if you've read any of his books, but he's written some really nice Native American religion books. So we were fortunate we got to meet all these people. Trying to think of who else. Well, then we have our American monks who have Swami Krishnananda was Swami Prabhavananda's sevak and attendant, and the first American monk of Southern California. He got his brahmacharya in 47. At the same time, the first two women got their brahmacharya. But he was his driver all the time, and he took pictures of everything and everyone. He had cameras, and there'd be hip shots, and he wrote down everything Swami said. He recorded all the time when he was with Swami Prabhavananda. And we have reels and reels of recordings of meditations. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And he used tape after tape. This was in the days when he had tapes, real tapes. And there it is. But he was ready to catch anything Swami said. He also took his own kind of shorthand. And we're lucky because his pictorial history and what he had written down is actually all in our archives now and has been digitalized. But he had, you're probably not familiar with footlockers that in the 60s we took them to college. They were trunks that were about this long, about this deep, and about that wide. And they opened up, we called them footlockers. And he had probably 100 of those filled with things of Swami Prabhavananda. Pictures, tapes, holy flowers, prasad from everywhere. When the first trip to India, when the 5 original nuns went, Krishnananda went, Swami Prabhavananda went, and they were on a ship. So they had trunks, and Brother was gathering, we called him Brother. Brother was gathering things at all of the holy places. He would bring dirt, and he would bring rocks, and he would bring, holy Mount Govardhan. This is the dust from Chairoti. This is the dust from Kamarpukur. And he had everything. He collected everything. And Prapaprana, our eldest nun, got really angry with him. And she said, "Brother, we cannot take all of this home. You have got to throw some of it out." And he didn't talk much. He went, "Mm." So she said the only thing he got rid of was her asana. He also did dishes as Swami Prabhupada stayed. We had 3 houses that we occupied. We occupied 2 of the houses, and the main house had 2 bedrooms hooked on it, and Swami Prabhavananda and Krishna stayed in one of those bedrooms, and any visiting Swami stayed in. We didn't have a monastery at the time. So Brother would do the dishes with us, and he always did the pots and pans. And bang, 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 and the water was so dirty, and all of us were kind of going, "Ugh." And one day I kind of nudged him off, and I said, "Brother, I'll do it." So I was doing it, and he was like this. And we had a copper-bottomed frying pan, and I washed it, and I didn't polish the copper bottom. And he looked at me, he said, "Energy crisis?" But he did everything. He had been also trained by Swami Prabhavananda. You do it as perfectly as you can. You don't rush through. You can rush through it if you can do it perfectly, but you must do it all. So, does anyone have any comments or questions or anything? Yes, I did know Swami Shraddhananda. You should get Vrajapani here, though. She knew him much better than I did. I knew him when he came to Santa Barbara. I only went to Sacramento when he was there maybe 2 or 3 times. I really am a stay-at-home nun. I really am. And he always brought, when he would come, it was always, he and Swami Swahananda were very close, because one had been Berkeley Swami and one had been Sacramento. They'd both been brought over for assistant Swamis to Swami Ashokananda. But then he divided the 3 centers and they all became independent right before he died. So Swami Shraddhananda and Swami Swahananda would get together. And when he came, he would just laugh and sing. He brought musicians. We were one day he was showing us how Ramakrishna danced. And he would dance in the living room and we'd take pictures of it. And we all go, how was that again, Swami? And he, like a lion. He was this little man. And at the time he was in a seersucker jacket. So it was cute. He also, one of our nuns she had quite a gravitas, and he said, you should lecture. And he gave her instructions on how she should, you do this, and then you do this, and then he had us in hysterics at the table, because it wasn't her personality. But we were remodeling the kitchen. And so we had a lean-to on the garage, which Salvation Army, that had 3 burners that worked, but it said it was an O'Keefe and Merritt, so it said Ohm on it. About 3 months to do it. Well, it took a little longer. Swami Shraddhananda came down with musicians from India. In those days, we were having quite a few musicians to come to the temple because they had an international music school attached to UCSB. But these were very special musicians. Now, we don't raise money and we don't charge for anything. And that's from Swami Prabhavananda's days. But we had to give money to these musicians because that's why they were in the United States. So we put a donation basket out and hope that people come through. But we were cooking in this shack, and Swami Shraddhananda said, I said, what would you like for breakfast? I want puris and potato curry. And I went, okay. So we made the potato curry and I'm making puris, and literally the stove to the picnic table had about this much room. And so I was kind of at the stove and I was almost flipping them over to his plate. And he was just, oh, this is wonderful. This is wonderful. This is just like at home. They're hot. They're just the way we had them when we were in India. The Swamis were all so kind and so encouraging and so, always boosting you up, except when they were scolding. One time in Hollywood, this was with Swami Chaitanya, Swami Prabhavananda had been at it, and that was the day he'd only yell when people came into the room. And finally he got me in tears, and I was crying, and I couldn't argue with him, but I was just like, oh my God, this poor old man, and I'm killing him. And I think he said I was killing him. He got that far, and I was and I went out of the room, and Swami Chaitanya tried to be very, very consoling. And he very sweetly came up to me and he said, now you understand, these are all blessings when you get a scolding from your guru. Well, I think I told you the other day, I kind of had a temper. And that I turned around to him and I went, do you think I would take this from anyone else? And I've often felt I was a little harsh there. I should have, been nice about it, but I wasn't. So, yeah, Swami Shraddhananda, quite a musician, loved good music. And one of the funniest occurrences was Swami Shraddhananda, Swami Prabhavananda, and Swami Pavitrananda singing Vespers together. Swami Shraddhananda knew what he was doing. Swami Prabhavananda didn't carry a tune very well. And they all had different timing. And Swami Pavitrananda mumbled. You could hardly understand what he said. He was wonderful, and he was always very inspiring when you could decipher what he was saying. But to hear them sing Vespers and Borda Prana, our musician, would just, it was the sweetest thing you'd ever hope to hear. It was so out of tune, and every one of them was singing to a different time. And there was so much devotion in it that you couldn't help but be moved to say, that's how it's done. You sing to the Lord from the bottom of your heart, whether you can sing or not. Yeah. Any other?
Can you share some experiences of the visits to India?
I'm sorry?
Can you share some experiences about your visit to India? How was it? When did you go?
Yes, of course. The first trip was in 1978, 2 years after Swami Prabhupada died. Our convent tried to get each one of the young nuns to India because we really didn't have that kind of background. And we read the gospel and we read all of the things, but the senior nuns felt it was really important to go over and experience the actual places where Holy Mother was, where Ramakrishna was, Bellarmine, Dakshineshwar, all of these places, and also to see how large and encompassing the organization that we had dedicated our lives to. So I was once again extremely fortunate. Borda Prana and I went in 78, and I was able to stay for 4 months. The two of us were able to stay for 4 months and travel all over. When we arrived, Swami Vreshwarananda was the president. I can't remember, Swami Vandanananda, I think, was one of the vice presidents. He may have been secretary then. And Swami Mastananda and Swami Gitananda were in the office. One of them, Gitananda, I think, was the treasurer. And at that time, Swami Abhayananda Bharat Maharaj was the manager. I heard he had been personally chosen by Swami Premananda to take that job. Did you hear that, Swami? I had heard that he had been handpicked because he had the right temperament. I don't know. Anyway, Suji Maharaj was alive still, Nirvanananda.
Yeah, he was vice president.
Yeah, and he had come to the United States with Swami Madhavananda to dedicate the temple in Santa Barbara. He was one of Swami Prabhuvananda's closest brothers. When Swami Prabhuvananda's mother was dying, Suji Maharaj went to her, and she was convinced that her own son had come. So they were that close. So we met all of these Swamis. We stayed in Bellarmine for probably two or 3 weeks when we first arrived. And I just read Borda Prana's diary of it. She said, my name was Sadika, and she said, Sadika is not pleased with Bellarmine. My first impression, we arrived at midnight in Dum Dum, and as I said, the place was underwater, and I mean all of West Bengal. All of Bengal was under the water, and nothing was dry. Everything was mildewy, and I got into the bed that night, and the mosquito net smelled so strongly of mildew, I thought, I'm not going to be able to breathe here much. By the next morning, when the sun came out, I thought I could manage it. I could do this for a short time. And then I was really unhappy when we had to leave. But yes, then we went to Nepal to see the Himalayas. We were in Varanasi. And at that time, Apurvananda Mat and Satan Maharaj, whom I don't even know what his name is. What is it? His Swami name. Satan Maharaj was in charge of the hospital. And Satan Maharaj had traveled around India with Swami Prabhavananda and the 5 nuns. And he remembered Bharataprana, and he, with great affection, and he was so happy. He cooked for us himself. And he gave us all these recipes, which I dutifully copied down, and I can't find anymore. But no, they're beautiful, beautiful. So then we went on to, where did we go next? We went to, I guess we went to Agra to see the Taj. And it was so beautiful. We arrived at the sunset hour, and it was just the most gorgeous sight I think I'd ever seen. Then we got on the train and went to Vrindavan and met Sudanshu Maharaj, who came and picked us up himself. He was he said, "Have you met a Swami who drives before?" I said, yes, Swami Prabhavananda had tried to drive, not too successfully, but he had done it. The famous story about him, he was driving and something happened, the brakes went out or something. And what was his reaction? He immediately crossed his legs, crossed his arms, and started to meditate. And O'Meal, one of his disciples, was in the back seat. And to have him tell the story, he says, and she started saying her mantra. Okay, what she was saying was, Jesus Christ. But his version, and she said her mantra. So I said, yes, I had met a Swami who had driven before, but God help us, they don't drive too often. And then we went on to Hardwar. I did not go to Mayavati, we went to Delhi. We went then to Jaipur, then we went to Mumbai, Konkan? No, not Konkan. Trivandrum. We went to Trivandrum. That was the only time we stayed at a Sarada Mat, because they said that in the early days, someone had arrived and the Western name was, what was it? Francis or something, and they didn't know whether it was a man or a woman. So the monks went to pick him up, and he was a woman. So they said, now we make sure all the women stay at Sarada Mat because we had nowhere to put her. And then we went on down to Kanyakumari and to the rock. At that time, the Vivekananda rock had only Swami Vivekananda's statue on it. There was none of the other buildings or shrines. But they didn't have any place for us to really stay. The Kendra, Vivekananda Kendra, had just been started, so we stayed there. And then we came up Madurai. What would be next? Well, no, we're inland for a while, where Holy Mother sat, and she would. Bangalore, we stayed in Bangalore. And then we went up to Madras. We also went to Orissa, we saw Bhubaneswar, we saw Puri. And then we went back to Vrindavan, because I really liked it. And back to Bellarmont, stayed in Bellarmont some more. But we took a good 4 months and had time in each place. Met a lot of the Swamis. And in those days in Bellarmont, they didn't have as I say, such strict rules because there weren't so many people coming. So we were able to go in at 4 a.m, meditate in Thakur's temple, then go around and meditate in each one of like Brahmananda's Holy Mother's, Swamiji's, then go see all the Swamis and greet them in the morning. They had a monks' conference while we were there, and Swami Kailashananda was there, and I met him. He died I think before we left India. And we had taken pictures of him because we were taking pictures all over. Brother had, at the last minute, we're getting on a plane. We have everything packed. And he handed me this bag with a camera and 50 rolls of film. And I went, brother, how am I gonna get this on the plane? He said, just do it. So we did. And I was so glad. I didn't know how to use a camera. It was little, it was about this big, but it came in very, very handy because I took pictures where you weren't supposed to. We were in Shivanath in Varanasi, and they said, don't take pictures. And it was under my shutter, and I was doing pictures like Krishna. Some came out, some didn't. So, and I don't remember what Swami Kailashananda said. I remember I was highly inspired. It was all about meditation. But one of my favorite, the monk I absolutely adored in Bellarmine was Bharat Maharaj, and I would sit with him. We would finish Arati, go around and see all the Swamis. And then I would sit in his office from, say, 7:30 till 9 when we went to get dinner at the guest house. He didn't speak English much. We managed, but just sitting with him was more than enough. And I went down highly enthusiastic, and I was rattling on to him saying, oh, Swami Kailashananda gave the most wonderful talk on meditation. It was just so beautiful. And he did it. And I went like a nitwit. And he looked at me and he went, I may differ. That was all he said. I may differ. Now, he was quite an Advaitist, wasn't he? Very much so. He hardly ever went to the shrine. He went to kind of check and see that everything was okay. He spent his entire, as far as I could see, the entire day in his office greeting every single person that came to the Mat. And he knew them by name. He asked about their families. And that was his, to make everyone feel extremely welcome in a family. Indira Gandhi had visited Bharat Maharaj every time she got to, because she had known him as a child. Everyone came to see him just because he was what he was. And he also was funny. Bhakti Prana from Hollywood was in India when Borda Prana and I were there. Was studying Bengali, and she was good at it, but she just learned the alphabet, and he said, read that sign, and she's carefully reading it out, and it was a Coca-Cola ad. And she's going, she said, it says Coca-Cola. Yeah. He also played music all day, all evening. And he said, you like? And I went, yes, I like it. He says, what kind? And I said, sounds like Bollywood to me. And he says, it is. He said, any song, anything is divine if you think of the Lord. And I've always remembered that too. Yeah. Because I happen to like Bob Dylan and a couple of rock and roll singers, and I never gave up the like of them. And Prana only liked classical music and Indian music. And I'd be playing Bob Dylan as I ironed, and she'd say, "How can you listen to that trash?" And I go, "I like it." So, any other? That was the trip to India. Okay, time? Okay. Thank you so much for being here.
It is so wonderful to listen to so many memories of Mataji, about the monks, about the India visit to India, and all were so inspiring and transforming our life. What has happened to her young woman coming and making a wonderful nun out of that by the blessing of all great monks she met, and also out of her spiritual practice, and above all, the blessing of Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, Swamiji, Swami Brahmananda, and all the brother disciples of Swami Vivekananda. And here we have Pravrajika Krishnaprana Mataji, so many years in and Vedanta is in her. So tomorrow we have a retreat, and she will give first two talks of what we have announced. So those who have registered, please come at 8:30. We'll have breakfast and registration, and then we'll start the retreat talks, etc. At 9:30. Thank you so much for being with the informal talk about the reminiscences of monks by Pravrajika Krishnaprana Mataji, a very senior nun of our Santa Barbara Convent, Sarada Convent, Santa Barbara, California. Thank you and good night to all of you.
Thank you.